Everybody remembers that Sapphira died. Almost nobody talks about the lie she chose to keep, and that is where the simple version starts to crack. The story usually gets compressed into something like this. A couple sells a property. They keep part of the money, they pretend they gave everything. Ananias falls dead, Sapphira walks in, she falls dead too, end of story. Except that version makes the whole thing sound like the problem was keeping some of the money. It was not. The property was theirs, the money was theirs, the decision was theirs. Nobody forced them to sell, nobody demanded that they hand over every coin. Peter would make that very clear. They could have kept the land. They could have sold it and kept part of the money. They could have sold it and kept all of the money. No one was running a holy tax office. The problem was the performance. Ananias and Sapphira wanted the reputation of total generosity without the inconvenience of actually being totally generous, because apparently looking completely devoted is much easier when complete devotion stays safely in the budget. They wanted the image of sacrifice. They just did not want the full sacrifice, so they created a cleaner version of the story. They sold the property, kept part of the money, and presented the rest as though it were the entire price. That difference is the center of everything. The problem was not the amount, it was the appearance. It was like making a public donation, accepting the applause, and quietly hiding the part of the receipt that would change how generous everyone thought you were. Nothing was wrong with keeping some. Everything changed when they pretended they had kept none, and the timing made the whole thing even more obvious. The early Christian community had become known for radical generosity. People were selling property, helping those in need and bringing resources to the apostles. Generosity was visible, and visible generosity comes with something humans have always found extremely attractive: a reputation. No miracle was required to understand the temptation. Someone gives everything, everyone notices, and suddenly sacrifice comes with social prestige attached. Ananias and Sapphira did not just want to contribute. They wanted to look like the kind of people who had given everything. That was the trap. They were not buying favor with a small offering. They were protecting an image with a false story. And that makes the episode much more uncomfortable than a simple warning about money. Money could have been kept honestly. The image could only be protected by deception. So the famous deaths were not really the beginning of the episode. The beginning happened earlier, somewhere before anyone entered the room, when a husband and wife agreed that the truth was less useful than the version that made them look better. Ananias would walk in first. Sapphira would come later, and she still had not entered the room, but the lie she would eventually defend was already waiting for her. Sapphira did not fall apart only when Peter questioned her. The crack started earlier, when she agreed to the story. Before Peter asked anything, there was already a plan. Ananias and Sapphira sold the property. They kept part of the money. They brought the rest, and then they presented that amount as though it were the full price. That is the uncomfortable part. They had options, a lot of them. They did not have to sell the property. They did not have to give all the money away. They did not even have to pretend they had given all the money away. But somehow they chose the one option that required a coordinated lie, efficient, just not in the way they probably hoped. They wanted the prestige of complete surrender without carrying the full cost of complete surrender. Because apparently looking honest becomes much more attractive when actual honesty starts getting expensive. And that is what makes the story sharper. This was not panic. This was not a confused answer given under pressure. This was not somebody saying the wrong thing because Peter surprised them. The version existed before the confrontation. They had already decided what people were supposed to believe. The public story was simple. They sold the property. They brought the money. They gave everything. The private story had one extra line. They had kept some. And that one hidden line changed the entire meaning. It was like posting the beautiful version of an event while cutting out the exact moment that would make everyone understand what really happened. The picture was technically real. It was just missing the part that mattered most. That was the performance. Ananias and Sapphira were not being condemned for having less generosity than somebody else. They were creating the appearance of more generosity than they had actually shown. The problem was not keeping a part. It was pretending they had given the whole. And once that version was agreed upon, each of them became responsible for carrying it. Ananias went first. He brought the money. He stood before Peter, and he presented the story. But Peter did not react as though he had discovered a minor accounting discrepancy. He went straight to the deception. Why had Ananias allowed this lie to take hold? Why pretend the amount represented something it did not? Peter even reminded him that the property had belonged to him before it was sold, and the money remained under his control afterward. In other words, nobody had forced this. That removed the easiest excuse. There was no need for the performance, no need for the fake total, no need for the carefully edited version. They had chosen it. Then Ananias heard Peter's words, and before the room had time to process what had just been exposed, he fell down and died. Suddenly, the lie was no longer a private agreement. It had consequences, and somewhere outside that room, Sapphira was still carrying the exact same version. She just did not know yet that it had already collapsed. Then Sapphira walked in. She had no idea what had happened to Ananias. No idea that Peter had already exposed the lie. No idea that the version they had agreed on had already collapsed. And that changed everything. Because this was no longer just about a lie planned earlier. It was no longer just about an agreement made somewhere in private. Now there was a question. Peter asked her directly whether the amount they had brought was the full price of the property. Simple question, very dangerous answer. And for one brief moment, Sapphira had a way out. She could tell the truth. She could break the agreement. She could stop protecting the performance. She could say, "No, we kept part of it." That would have been awkward, probably humiliating, definitely not the version they had prepared. But it would have been true. Sometimes the second chance does not arrive looking like comfort. Sometimes it arrives looking like a direct question. Peter was not asking her to invent anything. He was not asking for a complicated explanation. He was giving her one clean opportunity to stop defending the false version. And Sapphira answered, yes, that was the price. There it was. No new lie required, no improvisation, no emergency meeting. She only had to keep the old one alive. And she did, which is almost impressively efficient if the goal is to choose the worst possible moment to stay consistent. The question did not create the deception. It revealed that she was still committed to it. That matters, because Sapphira was not simply being punished for something Ananias had done before she arrived. She had participated in the plan. And now, standing alone before Peter, she confirmed it herself. It was like someone involved in a fraud being confronted after the scheme had already been uncovered, and still deciding that the safest move was to keep repeating the story. At that point, the lie is no longer hiding anything. It is just proving how badly the person wants the false version to survive. Sapphira had entered the room believing the plan was still intact. The audience already knew better. Ananias was gone. Peter knew. The truth was already sitting in the room before she arrived. She was the only one still performing, and that creates the brutal irony of the scene. She thought she was protecting the agreement. In reality, she was confirming her place inside it. Peter had not trapped her. He had asked. She had not been forced into the answer. She chose it. The moment was small. One question, one answer. But that answer carried everything that had come before it. The secret portion, the agreed story, the public image, the private truth. All of it was compressed into one confirmation, and now the phrase on the thumbnail finally started to become dangerous. Same story, same price, same performance, same lie. And here the lie stopped being a plan. It became a confirmation. Same lie, same version, same false price, same appearance, same performance. That is what makes Sapphira's part of the story so sharp. She did not walk into the room knowing that Ananias had already fallen. She walked in carrying the same story they had agreed on earlier, and when Peter gave her a chance to break from it, she protected it instead. That is the difference. This was not just repeating a wrong number, it was maintaining a false image when the truth could still have been told. The amount itself was never the center of the story. The image was. Sapphira was not defending a few coins. She was defending the version of herself and Ananias that those coins were supposed to create. Generous. Committed. Completely surrendered. At least from a safe viewing distance. The private reality was less impressive. They had kept part of the money, which again was allowed. They just did not want the public version to include that detail. This was not a story about a small offering. It was a story about a false image protected all the way to the end. That is much harder to dismiss. A small offering can be honest. A partial gift can be honest. Even keeping everything could have been honest. The performance was the part that required the lie. Apparently, honesty had one major disadvantage. It would ruin the presentation. So Sapphira stood there and confirmed the exact story that had already failed. She entered without knowing Ananias had fallen, but she walked straight down the same path he had chosen. That is the irony. One person had already been exposed. The second person still tried to save the story instead of saving the truth. It is like two people agreeing on a false version of events, one getting caught, and the other arriving later with absolutely no idea the script has already been thrown in the trash. Then someone asks one simple question, and instead of abandoning the script, the second person delivers the line perfectly. Wrong room, wrong moment. Excellent commitment to the bit. Peter knew what had happened. The audience knows what had happened. Sapphira did not. But ignorance about Ananias' death did not erase her knowledge of the agreement. She knew what they had planned. She knew what they had kept. She knew what she was claiming. And when the truth was placed directly in front of her, she chose the same lie. That is why the famous scene is not really the beginning. It is the caught in the act moment. The deception had already been built. Ananias had carried it into the room. Sapphira had carried it in later. He lied. She confirmed. Same plan. Same performance. Same lie. And now for Sapphira, the appearance they had worked so hard to protect was about to collapse completely. Because the story she thought she was defending had already reached its end. Sapphira kept the lie. And she died too. That is the payoff of the entire story. She had helped build the version. She entered later. Peter questioned her directly. She had a chance to tell the truth, and she confirmed the story anyway. Then Peter told her what she did not know. The men who had buried her husband were already at the door. Suddenly the room changed. The lie she thought she was protecting had not protected Ananias at all. There was no reputation left to save, no performance left to maintain, no carefully managed version still standing. Ananias was dead. The deception was exposed, and now Sapphira had confirmed it for herself. She fell down at Peter's feet and died. The same young men who had just buried Ananias carried her out too. Same lie. Same exposure, same end. And that is why reducing this story to God was angry because they did not give enough money misses almost everything important about it. This was never a divine complaint about donation size. They were free to keep the property. They were free to keep the money. They were free to give part of it. What they were not free to do was turn spiritual generosity into a performance and present deception as devotion. Ananias and Sapphira wanted more than to contribute. They wanted to look completely surrendered. Apparently, the reputation was valuable enough to lie for. That is what makes the story uncomfortable even now. Because spiritual performance did not disappear with ancient property sales. The costumes changed. The instinct did not. People still know how to stand on the stage of honesty while carrying a rehearsed script from backstage, and that was exactly what happened here. Ananias carried the script in first. Sapphira arrived later and delivered the same line. She did not die because her gift was too small. She fell after choosing to maintain a lie designed to make partial surrender look like total surrender. That distinction is the whole story. The money could have been kept honestly. The truth could have been spoken when Peter asked. The performance could have stopped. But Sapphira chose to protect the appearance even when she had a direct opportunity to abandon it. And in the end, the appearance protected nothing. Not the money, not the reputation, not Ananias, not Sapphira. The story began with two people trying to control how everyone else saw them. It ended with everything they had hidden exposed in public, which is a brutal way to discover that a polished image can survive many things, just not the truth. Sapphira kept the same lie, and the same lie reached the same end. Which misunderstood Bible story should be simplified next? Cain, Saul, or Absalom?